Greetings once again from Hong Kong. Last week's Easter message dealt with the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus and highlighted its significance for believers and non-believers alike. I pointed to the evidence for the crucifixion and made a brief statement concerning the evidence for the resurrection, but time did not allow me to go into any detail. However, this is such an important subject and so central to the Christian faith that this week I want to deal with the evidence supporting the resurrection of Jesus as a historical fact. Now, this is crucial to the faith for believers because it is at the core of the Christian faith, and also for non-believers who must not think they need to commit intellectual suicide to become a Christ follower. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, namely 1 Corinthians 15, verse 14, reinforces the crucial nature of the resurrection in the following words. And if Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. Now, much has been written on this subject by both believing and non-believing scholars. And I'll present the major arguments in favour of the authenticity of the resurrection in this message. As a byproduct, this will also address the arguments of the critics. If you're watching today and have yet to give your life to Christ, I ask two things of you. First, that you do not rule out the existence of the supernatural in this life, namely happenings and events that cannot be understood by natural explanations alone. And secondly, that you apply the principle of the best explanation. This is a rule applied to historical events and not a rule confined solely to Christian researchers. It is a general rule of interpretation of historical evidence. This means that we should accept a historical event as true on the basis that it is the best explanation of the surrounding circumstances. In considering the truth of the resurrection account, we need to recognize that not only is it central to the Bible because it is part of all the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we must also remember that two of the Gospel writers, Matthew and John, were almost certainly eyewitnesses to the various events of Jesus' life and death. Secondly, Mark and Luke most likely compiled their accounts from eyewitness testimonies. The importance of having eyewitness testimonies such as these should be seen in the light of the fact that archaeological evidence continues to support the Bible's historical accuracy, including the Gospel accounts. Anyone interested in the historical accuracy of the Bible should view a previous TLC World message under the title, Christianity, the One True Faith. In addition to the biblical accounts themselves, we should also acknowledge that there is non-biblical evidence for Jesus' existence, crucifixion, and resurrection, which can be collected from a combination of the works of Flavius Josephus, Cornelius Tacitus, and Lucian of Samosata, all of whom were opponents of the Christian faith. Let's now look at the evidence supporting the resurrection as a historical fact. Let's first look at the existence of the empty tomb. The major proof that Jesus rose from the dead is the empty tomb. Critics might argue that Christ's disciples had an interest in claiming that Jesus' tomb was empty to confirm a fiction that Christ had risen from the dead. This is a flawed argument because it suggests that the disciples were fully knowledgeable of the significance of the resurrection. Now, this just does not square with the account of the disciples' confused and fearful behavior immediately after Christ's crucifixion. Things only became clear to them after the resurrection, not before. So engineering a resurrection fiction on their part is just not plausible. Additionally, there is recognition from the enemies of Jesus that the tomb was empty. The biblical record of this recognition is in Matthew 28, verse 13 to 15, when the Jewish leaders told those who had been guarding the tomb to, and I quote, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away whilst we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread amongst the Jews to this day. The following quotation from S. Michael Hoodman, writing in the apologetics site www.gotquestions.com, further supports the fact that hostile witnesses confirmed the existence of the empty tomb. This is what he says: that the Jews accused the disciples of stealing Jesus' body is corroborated by the Christian apologist Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century, and then again around AD 200 by the church father Tertullian. Both Justin and Tertullian were interacting with the Jewish debaters of their day and were in a position to know what it was their Jewish opponents were saying. They were not simply relying on Matthew's gospel for their information. For both Justin and Tertullian mention specific details not found in the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, all three of these writers cite details not mentioned by the others. Based on these considerations, it appears that there was an early Jewish acknowledgement of an empty tomb. Furthermore, the inclusion of Joseph of Arimathea as the one who took Jesus' body and buried him in his own tomb also rules out the empty tomb as a fabrication. Joseph was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, a high-profile figure and member of the Jewish equivalent of the Supreme Court, who would have been well known in Jerusalem. Consequently, any fictitious account involving him would soon have been dispelled. Therefore, all the evidence from within the Bible and external to it from the enemies of the faith, who had absolutely no motivation to verify the existence of the empty tomb, confirms that the tomb was empty. Let's look at the proximity of the earliest preaching of the resurrection to the location of the actual event. The earliest preaching of the resurrection took place in the same city as Jesus had been buried. If one wanted to perpetuate a lie or a fiction, one would most likely go to an obscure place where people did not know the facts and preach there. That did not happen. The disciples preached the resurrection of Jesus in the city in which the tomb of Jesus was located. So if anybody wanted to dispute this preaching, all they needed to do was to go to the tomb and verify that Jesus' body was still there. This did not happen because the reality of the situation was that the tomb was empty. The third evidence is the testimony of women. Women were second-class citizens in biblical times, and their statements did not carry much weight. They were not even allowed to give evidence in court. However, the Bible clearly states that it was the women who first found the tomb empty. If the biblical account of the resurrection was fabricated by the gospel writers, it would not make sense for them to have the testimony of women as central to the account of Jesus' resurrection. The only reason that women are center stage in the resurrection account is because they were actually the discoverers of the empty tomb. Consequently, totally against the prevailing culture, the fact that the Gospels record that women were the first discoverers of the empty tomb indicates that the Gospel accounts are real accounts of the resurrection and not fiction. Some more support for the resurrection story is the closeness in time of the resurrection story to the actual event itself. Generally, the closeness in time to the actual event that an account is written, the more likely the account is true. This is quite simply because there may still be people around who know of the actual event and can dispute the account. And also there is less time for fabrications and legends to be built around the event. There are good reasons for believing that the first account of the resurrection was very close to the actual event. One being that the co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan, confirms this proximity in the following statement. Paul wrote to the Corinthians from Ephesus in the early 50s CE, but he says in 1 Corinthians 15:3 that I handed on to you as of first importance, which I in turn received. The most likely source and time for his reception of that tradition would have been Jerusalem in the early 30s when, according to Galatians 1:18, he went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. True Christians can consider Crossan to be a hostile witness, given that he co-founded a pseudo-think tank with an anti-Christian agenda made up of a controversial group of scholars who hold public forums that cast doubt on the authenticity of many sayings and deeds attributed to Jesus. Nevertheless, Crossan confirms that Paul's account of events surrounding the resurrection, especially the subsequent appearances of Jesus, which are the subject of the passage commencing with 1 Corinthians 15:3, are taken from sources no later than 4 years after the actual events. Having the first account of a historical event just 4 years after it happened is very unusual in historical analysis, and it contrasts starkly with accounts of historical events which we take for granted as true. For example, much of what we know of ancient Roman history we take from the writings of Caesar and Tacitus. However, the earliest copy of Tacitus' work is dated 1100 years after the events he describes, and in the case of Caesar, around 900 years after the events described. This world generally takes the accounts of Tacitus and Caesar to be true and bases history books on them, despite the long time span between the events described and recording of them by these two ancient writers. Surely, therefore, there is every reason to believe in the truth of the account of Paul concerning the resurrection of Christ and his subsequent appearances, written by him approximately 20 years after the events described and based on a source just 4 years after these events took place. In support of the resurrection account is the appearance of Jesus after his resurrection. Linked to the previous point is the actual content of 1 Corinthians 15, in particular verses 3 to 7, in which Paul provides the account of the appearance of Jesus as follows. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Now, I've already established, when discussing the closeness in time of the resurrection story to the actual event, that Paul penned 1 Corinthians 15 in the early 50s AD. This means these particular verses refer to events probably no later than 20 years previous to their writing. Furthermore, as mentioned above, these verses are based on sources dating no later than 4 years after the actual crucifixion and resurrection. This proximity in time means that if they were fabricated, they could easily be disputed by those still alive at the time Paul was writing. Nothing countering Paul's claims in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7, has been unearthed. One of the most powerful evidences in favour of the accuracy of the resurrection account is the changed lives of those to whom Jesus appeared. After the crucifixion, but before the resurrection, Jesus' disciples were in hiding, believing they may be next for execution. Peter's denial of Christ 3 times exemplifies the feelings of the disciples at this time. After the account of the resurrection, these same men became bold preachers, risking their lives to preach, and ultimately, with the exception of John, experiencing horrific martyrdoms. How could a group of timid men in hiding become the glorious apostles as we now know them? The simplest, most reasonable explanation is that they had experienced the risen Lord, which dispelled any fear of death. They quit hiding because they witnessed the truth of the resurrection firsthand. Similarly, James, the brother of Jesus, previously a skeptic regarding Jesus' status as the Messiah, became the courageous leader of the church in Jerusalem and was later stoned to death for his faith. The most reasonable explanation for his change of heart is that the account of Paul in 1 Corinthians is true, and that James experienced the resurrected Jesus. Of course, Paul himself experienced the resurrected Lord, and from being a persecutor of Christians as Saul, became the long-suffering, great evangelist Paul, who can rightfully be called the greatest missionary other than Christ who has ever walked this earth. These life changes can only reasonably be explained by the fact that the disciples, James and Paul, experienced the resurrected Christ. A powerful argument in favour of the resurrection account in the Bible is the weakness of alternative explanations. Critics have constructed various theories to suggest that the resurrection account is a fiction conjured up by believers. None of these theories stand up to scrutiny. One theory is that Christ did not actually rise from the dead, but his body was stolen. The problem with this theory is to find suitable candidates for the theft. The Jews and Romans had no motive for the theft, in fact, just the opposite. Similarly, the chances of a group of timid disciples attempting to overcome a highly trained Roman guard, who had the threat of death hanging over them should anyone attempt to tamper with the tomb they were guarding, is so implausible that it can be discounted. A further theory is that the women simply went to the wrong tomb. Of course, it's possible that one person could mistakenly go to the wrong tomb, but the more persons involved, the less likely this is. For the wrong tomb theory to be valid, this would require not only all the women individually to get the location wrong, but also Peter and John, the Roman guards, the Jews, and anyone else who tried to produce Jesus' body. Finally, it's been speculated by critics that Jesus did not actually appear to the disciples or the 500, but that all were collectively hallucinating. There are a number of valid objections to this theory, but central to these is the total absence of any record of group hallucinations. In fact, clinical psychologist Gary A. Sibcy has stated this: "I have surveyed the professional literature, peer-reviewed journal articles and books written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades, and have yet to find a single documented case of a group hallucination." In summary, none of the alternative accounts of the resurrection and his subsequent appearances to the disciples, James, Paul, and the 500 are credible. Let me just summarize. At the beginning of this message, I requested that anyone who was skeptical about the resurrection of Jesus as an actual historical fact should suspend a mindset that preempts the possibility of the supernatural, and also apply the principle of the best explanation. Assuming that the skeptic has done the former, the principle of best explanation resoundingly supports the resurrection as an actual historical event. Incredible as it may seem, Jesus, our God, the creator of the universe, walked this earth as a man, was crucified, and after 3 days was resurrected, walked again on this earth, and was witnessed doing so by over 500 people. The Easter message last week focused on the significance of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. The significance of the resurrection for the Christ follower is summarized in John 5, verse 24, and is best stated in the King James Version of this verse. This is what it says: "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me hath everlasting life, and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from death unto life." Belief in the person of Jesus Christ and his resurrection guarantees everlasting life to the believer, to be spent in heaven with Jesus rather than being condemned to an eternity spent with the enemy. Now, for the Christ follower, I hope this message has been a reinforcement and an encouragement. And for the non-believer, a reason to seriously consider giving one's life to Jesus. If you fall into this category and you'd like to explore the Christian faith further, we're ready to help. Just email admin@thelittlecHurchworld.org and we will help you on your way. All that remains for me now is to wish you a blessed week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Goodbye.